Hi everyone, welcome. I'm preparing to head down to my wormery to work on my oldest systems, and they're the ones here on the top of the list of active worm bins. These are European nightcrawlers that have been living in a couple of these bus boxes now for 322 days. So it was during their first 300 days in service that I treated as their composting phase, and on day 300 we started into the migration of the worms, which has been going on for the past 22 days. So 22 days ago was where we applied horizontal feeding number 1, and that was meant to try to lure the worms out of their finished castings over into the collection area. And then we came back. 7 days later elapsed before we came back for the second check-in to give horizontal feeding number 2, and then another 7 days elapsed, which took us to 8 days ago. So I was trying to maintain this 7-day pattern, but I got really busy yesterday, just couldn't get around to doing it. But now we're going to finally get around to doing the haul out. So that's what these little indicators show here, is just work to be done. And once we're finished, these systems are going to be pretty much taken out of service. The worms that we haul out of these 2 systems are going to be used to launch off 3 new yellow buckets. Were built and inoculated 11 days ago, and those are what I have labeled as yellow rectangular buckets number 3, 4, and 5. I've got yellow rectangular buckets 1 and 2 in service up here with African nightcrawlers in them. Down here we're going to be getting the Euros into these yellow buckets, and after that we're just going to take the finished castings they left behind in these 2 bus bins, and we're going to place them into this somewhat larger bus bin that I've got, and we're going to initiate a baiting of the worms out of that material. So that's what I've got on the game plan today. Let's head down to the wormery and get started on it. So here's the bins with the horizontal migration in progress. Hopefully we've got a good many worms gathered over here on the horizontal migration feeding zones. And that slightly larger tub into which I'm going to place all the finished castings is right up here, and I've already pre-built the bait box. And the bait box was set up not only with bedding and moisture, but there's also some coffee and worm chow in there as food for them to nibble on. And I guess along those same lines, food was also applied to their new homes. Yellow buckets numbers 3, 4, and 5. And once they've got worms living in them, they too will be set up with stickers to show the start date and the breed of worm that lives in there. So why don't we get started with getting the feeding zones emptied out and doing the haul out and consolidating the castings into a single spot and setting up the bait box. That should go pretty quick. Let's get started. So now, ever since we started this migration of these worms 22 days ago, we've checked in on the system together almost every time. Every time we came in to check on the progress and to replenish the food supply and bedding supply in the feeding zones, there was a video prepared, with the exception of the last check-in, which was only 2 days ago. You might have noticed it on my tracking spreadsheet. And during that time, the only thing I did was I aerated. I didn't add food to the horizontal migration feeding zone. So the horizontal migration feeding zones were fed 3 times. Once at the launch, twice during check-ins, and in a way, even though the system, according to my tracking spreadsheet, I think shows 29 feedings in total over the lifespan, those last 3 feedings that were used to just get the worms to come over to this side of the bin, and, you know, whatever material that they created over here in the horizontal migration feeding zones is going to get hauled out with them. I don't even really treat that as the, those last 3 feedings don't, to me at least, don't count as far as stuff that went into the creation of all this castings material. So the last 3 feedings that we gave them, whatever castings they created over in the horizontal migration feeding zone is just going to go with them to their new home. Every time we came in here to kind of aerate and to check on the worms and to replenish the food supply and stuff like that, we never fiddled with the little cardboard divider that I had placed in here to sort of segment the nice finished castings from the horizontal migration feeding zone, thinking that, you know, if we can avoid littering these nice castings with little bits of leftover food and bedding, then that would be nice. We would just end up with nicer castings in the end. And I guess I'm not all that worried about leaving a little bit of it with the worms to go with them into their new home. I did have a issue one time trying to introduce worms into their new home, and in that occasion I'd gone to extreme measures to really separate the worms from the castings, so, and any other surrounding material that could have accompanied them into their new home as familiar material. It was just a pile of worms, no familiar material, and there was really something wrong in the new systems that I had created for them. And unfortunately, all those worms ended up dying in that occasion. And I think ever since then, the few worm bins that I've launched ever since then, that was a few months ago, I've been leaning towards the thinking that bringing some familiar material with the worms over into their new home is probably a good way to ease them into their new home, where they can just sort of hang out in the old stuff until such a time that they're comfortable moving into the new stuff, you know. And if the new stuff is screwed up somehow and will cause the worms to die if they try to move into it, then they could simply steer clear and never go into this stuff and just remain in the familiar material that they came over with. I mean, it might be cramped, but at least it's material that's not going to do them in. So my past few worm feedings have not tried, I mean, my last few worm bin launches have been done in a way that I didn't worry too much about trying to, you know, get to worms only. You know, I was a-okay bringing all this extra material along for the ride, so that, you know, when they get into their new home, they can hang out in this familiar material for as long as they like, and then they could, you know, shove off when they're ready. Look at all these springtails. I don't know. Somehow springtails are just part of the deal anymore in a lot of my systems. But I think we're at that point now where we've piled up all the finished castings and separated them from what we're going to haul out. So I've got my green tray here. Why don't we do this? We're going to do this kind of in reverse order, I guess. We're going to set up the tray over here, and I'll do system number 2 first, and then I'll reorient myself to get my gloved hand in position to be able to haul out the stuff that's over in bin number 1. So it does look like we've got ourselves a nice turnout so far in that first handful. Here's some of that divider, that little perforated cardboard partition that can go with them into their new home as well. So it does seem to me like we're pulling out a great many worms over here. And in the end, I'm just going to sort of do my best to split all these worms up 3 ways to be, you know, loaded into those yellow buckets over there. I'm almost getting that feeling like we've probably got enough European nightcrawlers over here to launch perhaps not just 3 buckets. We could probably get these little guys running in 5 or 6 buckets. Well, whatever. I guess our buckets are going to be a little bit crowded. Well, either way, we're taking them out of 2 systems and introducing that same number of worms that lived in 2 systems into 3 systems, even though the buckets do seem to be a little bit more constrained in space. Not quite as large, I suppose, but I think they're going to be okay. So, I'm starting to get to the end of the haul out of tray number 1, but you know, we didn't pay a whole lot of attention to trying to get every last worm out of here. Whatever worms were still lingering over in the finished castings are going to get baited out later. So I'm not worried too much about stragglers right now. We're just going to press on and get the haul out of the second tray done over here. But you know what? Let's reorganize a little bit. Let's get this thing out of our way so we can get my gloved hand into the proper orientation for this so I can do it as gracefully as I could possibly arrange in such conditions. So on to the haul out of the worms that occupy bin number 1. And it's going to be much the same deal, I guess. We're just going to bring them over. This is going to give us all a nice little glimpse into how many worms we're pulling out in total from both systems. And then I guess my method of splitting this up is really just going to be to sort of divide this stuff here into 3 equal portions. Hopefully it'll be occupied with 3 equal quantities of worms, and use those worms to launch off our nice yellow buckets. So I can always feel the worms in between my fingers as I reach into this material to grab a handful, and it certainly seems like this migration has worked well. I mean, there is a lot of worms hanging out in these horizontal migration feeding zones, that's for sure. And we did pull out a good bit of, you know, leftover bedding material that they've not yet worked down. But as we, you know, pull this stuff out here, it does seem like they've been busy creating castings in their new end of the bin that they've been gradually gathering in over here for the haul out. And like I said, I don't really see the food that was used to create this material this castings material that we're hauling out right now. That doesn't really get chalked up to what the final yield was for these 2 now completed systems. To me, it almost seems like the castings that we're gonna get from these are, you know, overall feedings minus the feedings that were given during the migration. So we're gonna set these little guys aside for now, because I'd like to kind of wrap up getting the haul out of not only the worms, but also their castings over into the bin where we're going to run the baiting. So why don't we get that set up next, and then we'll proceed to that. Alright, so now my hope for getting this material transferred over into this slightly larger bus bin is that I can do so without creating a huge mess. I mean, I suppose pouring it over would be the most simple approach if it'll let me. I always get so paranoid, especially with the camera rolling. It just feels like huge potential for egg on face. So let's just see how this might play out. I'm wondering if just pouring it might work, you know. I mean, I was in here only 2 days ago to aerate, so the material should flow pretty freely and not be too compacted. And that seems to be the case. And as you can see, we're kind of worm free. I mean, that's an exaggeration. Clearly, we're not 100% worm free. There's definitely still some wormies remaining in this castings material, but certainly nothing like what we saw gathered together in the horizontal migration feeding zones. So as far as migration or evacuation goes, I would say that this was pretty successful. And, you know, we're usually not satisfied with pretty good around here. We're always trying to strive for that next level if it's possible. And I mean, you know, some people might say, hey, what's the big deal? You're going to be using that material out in the garden. If there's a few worms remaining in it, what's the harm? They're just going to be set free, and they'll probably do your soil in your garden good too. So that's another train of thinking on this sort of stuff that is also 100% okay, but we always like to see if we can keep the family together and try to not separate too many of them when we do these haul outs and harvests of castings. So I usually do my best to try rounding up stragglers. So that was pretty painless. Here and there some material still seems to be holding together because of moisture content, I assume, but for the most part I like the consistency. There is a good bit of moisture in here, but you know, the system is going to sit uncovered, allowed to continue drying, and then the bait box will be positioned somewhere in the middle, and then it'll receive periodic check-ins to take the dried material on the surface blend it in throughout to drive the moisture content of the material throughout the system down to the point where worms are going to hopefully gather in the bait box. So let me go get the other tray so we can empty that one into here as well. Okay, so here's tray number 2, and I'm wondering if we can pull it off, maybe do a similar smooth move here. Let's just go nice and easy. Let's not be in a hurry. It's like famous last words. And I guess I gotta make room right below where the stuff is pouring to make sure it has somewhere to go. And hopefully I've not made a major capacity miscalculation. It did seem to me like the castings in these two systems would be an amount that would get us pretty close to being full, but not entirely full in this slightly larger bus bin. Alright. I wonder if I could have possibly just stirred this material around to just dislodge it from itself and from the bottom of the bin a little bit better to get it more smooth and free-flowing. Might have come out of the tray a little bit more readily, but I really can't complain. I think this worked out quite nicely. So that now officially brings us to the end of these two systems. But until we've completed the roundup of the stragglers and the baiting of the worms out of their finished castings, we're not going to consider this as finished castings. And we're not going to really consider these as 100% done either. I mean, I'm going to treat these as harvested bins and the worms hauled out. I'm kind of just treating this roundup of stragglers and the baiting as sort of a separate thing, but these stickers will come off both of these now retired systems and be affixed to this, just so we know what worms we're trying to bait out of here. But I think we're ready to get the bait box situated and let that process take over. So let's level things off here to some degree. I mean, I think for the most part we were able to see what this material looked like as it was coming out of bin number 2. It was similarly depopulated and more or less worm-free. And like I said earlier, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. So it certainly wasn't worm-free, that's for sure, but hopefully it'll be closer to being worm-free once we run the run the bait box and try to get the stragglers baited out of this material, and then we can really write this stuff off as a complete and harvested batch of worm castings. So the baiting device is right over here. There we go. And I mean, I flashed it earlier on the screen. There's not a whole much to it, just some bedding in here, moistened pretty thoroughly with some coffee and worm chow so that the worms have a little something to nibble on. And every now and then I'll come in and I'll give this material a little bit of a stir, just so that I could submerge material on the surface that's had a chance to dry with the more damp material down low. Every time I do that, I feel like I'm creating an environment less and less hospitable for worms to want to remain in, hopefully spurring on the final depopulation of the worms from their harvested castings. So I think we're now ready to move on to the yellow buckets and the release of the worms into their new home. Let's get that started. Okay, so the worms are up here on the bench, all set to go. They're propped up high on a bucket here to make it easy for me to slide their new accommodations in underneath the rim. And as you can see, bucket number 3 is where we're starting. Buckets number 4 and 5 are on the floor, all set to go to receive worms as well. So without any further ado, I think we're going to start into launching these buckets. And as always, I'm always looking forward to hearing what people think in terms of how many worms we launched into any of my systems. So we may or may not get a good view of what we're dealing with here. I mean, we had a chance to see how many worms came out of the 2 trays when we harvested. So, and now I guess we'll get a little bit of a view of how many worms we're releasing. So I'll be looking forward to seeing what everyone thinks. Please leave me a comment and let me know how many worms are being released into each system. I suppose I'll try to jiggle around each handful enough to give everyone a quick little glimpse into how many worms were in each handful before I bring the next one in and cover it up. I see lots of little thin baby worms. These Euros must have been busy breeding. I'm pretty sure that during the past few check-ins I've been, maybe it was with the other Euro bins, I'm not even sure if it's these particular Euros, but I definitely recall seeing cocoons recently, and from cocoons come baby worms. And I'll tell you, I got a feeling these buckets are going to be quite heavily populated. I think this is going to be, let me see, let's get this out of here and see what it looks like in terms of the rest of the green tray. I mean, the entire green tray, have we got a third of it? I think we're pretty close. Maybe we'll just grab another little small handful for good measure. And we're going to treat that as the official launch of yellow bucket number 3 with the Euros. And a lot of times when I release the worms, I kind of run a little bit of a time lapse to give everyone a chance to see how the wormies squirm down into the material and out of view. I think today we're just going to press on. We're just going to try to get this completed, and that means we'll set bucket 3 aside, and in can come bucket 4. All set to go here to receive wormies. Yeah, I think we're just going to do these as production line style and just get them done. Try to minimize the, stress that the little wormies have to endure as part of this process. I mean, it is always possible that the worms have sort of maybe gathered together in this green tray into little pockets. Perhaps there's going to be handfuls that seem to be bigger than others. But I think personally, when it comes to making my own personal estimate for how many worms occupy these 3 yellow buckets, I believe I'm just going to come up with some sort of a common number that I think is suitable for each. Naturally, I'll be watching the same video you do when I'm editing it, and after I've finished it, I'll screen it just to see what I see and see what you see, and see if I can possibly come up with estimates that are equal. I'd like for these buckets to start off with equal numbers of worms if possible, and while there's no hard and fast certain way to ensure that, I think it is probably fair to say that we're probably going to have 3 buckets with very similar worm counts living in them. So I don't know, did we get 2/3 out of here so far, leaving 1/3 for the last bucket number 5? Perhaps one more little good measure handful, and then we can get the last of the wormies loaded into bucket number 5, and I think for the most part we'll be done here. I'll naturally have a whole bunch of cleaning up and putting away to take care of off camera, but I won't be boring you with any of that stuff. Now, here, I guess we'll just unload what remains. Here I'm sort of using each handful as the capacity of one grip, and it feels to me like we've so far loaded what appeared to me like 3 good at capacity grips into each bucket, maybe 3.5 or maybe even closer to 4, perhaps closer to 4, with those little good measure grips coming in at the end. So this would be like, capacity grip number 3. And then I guess if we feel like we've already loaded equivalent amounts of worms into each system and we're still left with a certain amount, this would be like that good measure, last little bit. And yeah, lots of worms in these systems, that's for sure. I'm almost wondering if perhaps I could just grab this handful and toss them over into bucket number 4 over there, and I don't know if I could reach bucket number 3 is all the way on the other end of the table over there, but maybe we'll try to be fair and do our best to make these 3 systems equal as far as worm populations go. But I think for the most part we've managed to migrate our worms out of their old homes into their new homes, set up their old castings for baiting so that we don't leave any wormies behind. And, well, I guess at this point I really do have a bunch of cleaning up and putting away to take care of. And don't worry, I'll take care of these last little wormies in these trays and all that other fun stuff. But at this point, I think we've pretty much reached the end of the video. So, you know what? Why don't we leave it at that? Don't forget, I'd really love to hear everyone's thoughts in terms of how many worms were released into each bucket. If you think that you've got 3 separate estimates for how many worms went into bucket number 3, into number 4, and number 5, then please be specific and let me know. But if you've got just one common estimate for how many worms went into these buckets, then just say, hey, I think each bucket has this many worms. So please leave a comment. That's what I'm really looking forward to hearing from everyone. But that's pretty much it for the video, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.